Joining us is the renowned Edward Luttwak, historian, expert on grand strategy, geoeconomics, military history, and international relations. He's a prolific author whose books are translated into dozens of languages and used in war colleges. He's advised presidents, prime ministers, among many other exploits, activities, and accomplishments, including cattle ranching in Bolivia. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Mr. Luttwak.
Thank you.
I first became familiar with your work back in 2008 when your book Turbo Capitalism was assigned reading by my Hungarian geopolitics and geoeconomics instructor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. And so I've been following you on X, and I read your recent excellent analysis at Unheard on Trump tariffs, and thought it'd be great to have you on to get your broad insights. And you've written many books, books on the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, of the Byzantine Empire. In some ways, I see American empire as a continuation of the Roman Empire, and tariffs seem to be part of its current grand strategy. But to start, maybe, you've written previously as well in articles that, quote, the overall power of the Russian Federation has been greatly diminished by its failure to swiftly conquer Ukraine, as all had expected, and the overall power of China has been eroded. Could you give us your thoughts from your vantage point on what is at play right now on the grand chessboard, so to speak, where demarcation lines seem to be shifting once again, while there's talk of the decline of the West, a rising global South led by Russia and China?
Well, as you know, the West has a lot of problems of different kinds. There is a question of culture, which is sharply a question in England, which is undergoing, all kinds of transformations, some of them very unwelcome. And sort of I said, this problem, that problem, a lot of the NATO armies are not real armies. They just wear uniforms and eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but are not mentally, morally ready to fight and so on. All terrible problems. But as you know, the West is diverse, it's heterogeneous, it has different strengths and weaknesses, and has islands of great strength. Certain things that are extremely strong. So I do not see a shift in the balance of power. Certainly not Russia, because the decision of President Putin to start a war in Ukraine and then not to win the war in Ukraine, because he did not declare war, he did not mobilize the Russian people. He didn't, stand there and say, divide, just go and do it. Go to Kiev for me in 3 days, 4 days. He didn't do any of that. It was a half-hearted thing, like a lady going to have tea. Orders the tea, waits for the tea, but then doesn't really drink the tea. She just sort of sips the tea. That's one. And the other, of course, is China. China today threatens war and prepares for war every day more in regard to Taiwan. But, of course, primarily relies on the treason of the Kuomintang military officers that are still there, which mysteriously the Taiwanese government, whose president is Min Ah-hwa, speaking Taiwan native, like the previous, in fact, they haven't cleaned out the shop. They haven't fired all these useless generals with their glittering uniforms and medals from battles and wars that are not recorded in history. They haven't done any of that. So, and the problem with Xi Jinping, as you followed, I'm sure, and you just see where he speaks, to whom he speaks, and how he speaks, is that he's absolutely obsessed with showing the world that Chinese people can fight, contrary to all of history, where they were invaded by 3 or 4 people on horseback, were defeated, and then ruled by conquest dynasties. Turkic dynasties, Mongol, Manchurian, and so on. Contrary to that, he wants to show that the Chinese can fight. They're great fighters. This is like Mussolini. After the First World War, all Italians were very, very happy about having defeated the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Themselves, with a little bit of help from the British and the French and so on. And they have Via Veneto in Rome, Via Vittorio Veneto to celebrate the great victory. Everybody was happy, except only Mussolini couldn't get it out of his head that the Italian army had been smashed at Caporetto by the Habsburg army, and with Württemberg mounted infantry commanded by an unknown officer called Rommel. Rommel was in Caporetto. So the, only Mussolini remembered this. And therefore, when in 1940, he pushed the Italian army to invade France, even though no Italian general was ready to fight. They all told him, don't do it. You're crazy. Sit down, have another pasta and spaghetti. So Xi Jinping is the same way. He goes around visiting military bases and makes the same speech always. We must be ready to fight. We must be ready to fight and win and all that stuff. He himself, stands a lot of parades and salutes and so on. And most important, most telling, most irrefutable is that at the 24th Party Congress, which is a huge occasion, they only have once in 5 years, the hero of the last Party Congress was Colonel Ki Fao Bao, who is the big, tall, stuff, aggressive, loudmouth who started the Galwan fight with India in June 2020, which led to the death of maybe 30, 35 Indian military officers and men, and 4 Chinese PLA people. And he was filmed there in the middle of that frozen river, hitting people, with a big thing, a big hit on his head and so on. He was made the hero among all the billion Chinese, was singled out to be the hero of the occasion they only have every 5 years, and which started with the film thing of him first refusing to negotiate with the Indians. There was some Indian officers standing, he's filmed there, it's all filmed, standing in front of him wanting to say, come on, let's fix this. And he said, rah, 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 rah. And then him in the middle of the river, that is the film that was used to inaugurate the 24th Party Congress. This is Mussolini. Mussolini, which is a guy obsessed with showing stuff. The truth is that even in 1979, when they invaded Vietnam, they were not only defeated, but humiliated, because Vietnam was swinging its army around to invade Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge were the only allies Beijing had. So the Chinese army goes on the border of North Vietnam. It goes there at the border to compel the Vietnamese army to withdraw from Cambodia. Well, they don't withdraw. Instead, they hold the Chinese with the local defense militia, with these middle-aged people, 40 years old, 50 years old, some 70 years old, with the guns left over from the French Indochina War, from Vietnam War, all kinds of things, and they are enough to kill 30,000 Chinese and not allow them to get to Hanoi. And that he wants to show that now is not 1979, now they're ready to fight, because they spend all this money and they have all these beautiful uniforms and they're parading all the time and saluting and marching and so on. But it's the same story as with Mussolini. When the Italian troops in North Africa, more than 100,000 of them, were attacked by maybe 12,000 British troops, they surrendered. They were sensible people and so on. The problem Xi Jinping is trying to fight against history, and he's trying to fight against the essence of the Chinese nation as a peaceful nation. Peaceful nation that expanded territorially, great conquest, simply by having more children and growing more rice, and more children, more rice, but who are not fighting people. Not everybody's a fighting people. The Arabs have the same problem. They keep wanting to solve the problem with Israel by fighting. They should take some other approach, like playing tennis or chess or something. Fighting is not their thing. And the Chinese are not fanatics and so on. They're too civilized. They're like Italians. And you can do anything with Italian soldiers except to get them to fight. You can equip them beautifully or equip them poorly, beautiful uniforms or ugly uniforms, they won't fight.
And since we're on the military dimension here, I was researching your writings a decade ago. I think you gave an interview where you said there will be no Third World War. There's not enough resources. And just any further thought, we've got a few hot spots, a few fires burning. Ukraine, of course. There's the Middle East, which I want to ask you about as well, and then the Taiwan issue. Do you feel, has your position changed over the decade?
Listen, you know that there's not going to be a Western European attack on Moscow. And there's going to be enough support for Ukraine to survive. And that's it. They're not going to support Ukraine so it can march to Moscow. Neither will the Russians suddenly stop fighting this war with their left hand and do a national commitment, mobilize the army and all that stuff. From the first day of this war, only for the first 3 days, there were active duty soldiers involved. The rest of the time, all the fighting was done by contract soldiers who had once served, maybe in a combat capacity, maybe not, and who are there because they're paid, $1,400 a month, and the death benefits are great. And in fact, the best career a Russia can have now is to get killed in Ukraine, because there's a very large payment from the presidency, and then there's a separate payment from an oblast that varies according to the wealth or poverty of oblast, but still, it's a lot of money. And then there's a monthly pension. So this is not, you're not going to get a big war out of there. And for China, they're going to try to grab Taiwan. In the course of grabbing Taiwan, they run into a U.S. ship. They will not run away. They will try to sink the U.S. ship. The idea is we sink a U.S. ship and then we proclaim victory, and then we can have a big, big victory parade and show that the new Chinese man is not like all the Chinese of 2,000 years. He is different. He fights. He's a fighter. Just Benito Mussolini. It won't happen, but naturally, once you sink an American ship, the other American ships don't go home. They sink you. They attack you. So there'll be a lot of damage, at least, and if not worse, and so on. But what has happened while nobody was looking, is that we entered the post-nuclear era. We had so many years when war was not possible for China or Russia because, of course, it would escalate to nuclear weapons. And nobody wanted a nuclear war. Nobody could withstand a nuclear war. And so on. And what happened is that Putin, by invading Ukraine, not succeeding in a week, as he was told that would happen, even then, only some of his loud dogs like Medvedev, who talk about tactical nuclear weapons. And there were some foolish journalists who start using this phrase, tactical nuclear weapon. That's a nuclear weapon you can actually use because it's not strategic, it's not big, it's small, and so on. This is nonsense, absolute nonsense. The nuclear weapon is an absolute difference, absolute. So Putin then, after a while, decided and told the truth. We can only use nuclear weapons if Russia is about to be destroyed by nuclear weapons. So what's happened is we are in a post-nuclear era. It's untidy because there's still all these nuclear weapons lying around, but it's a post-nuclear era. So we're back to where we were before the nuclear weapon, in which there's ample possibility of people having military adventures and wars, and including China and Taiwan. And as you know, President Trump arrived here and addressed President Putin of the Russian Federation and say, look, I'm the President of the United States. I never called you a criminal. I never insulted you. I never treated you like you're this or that. And now I'm here to stop the war. And instead of answering, Putin did the worst possible thing. He sent Lavrov, his time-serving Gromyko imitation foreign minister, the one who never contributes anything to solve any problem, and whose favorite word is "niet." Lavrov, or Lavrovian, he's a Ukrainian, he's an Armenian and so on. Lavrovian, a wonderful man. He knows Sinhalese and Maldivian. He speaks Maldivian. He studied Maldivian. Imagine you're a Russian diplomat and you study Maldivian as well as Sinhalese. And when Putin did not say to Trump, "Let's get together, let's have a drink together, let's talk," since you, Trump, never insulted me, you were always polite towards me, so let's meet and let's see if we can do something. Instead of that, he sends Lavrov. So I'm afraid these are unresolved problems. And then, of course, in the Middle East, the Israelis have, as usual, won most of the war. Everybody always thinks they're very strong. Islam makes its followers feel that they're very strong. Allah, Allah. So their names are all about victory. Abdel Kahir, the son of conquest, the servant of conquest, Abdel Fath, and all that kind of stuff. But the fact is that when it comes to real fighting, there isn't all much strength to fight there. So, and in the Iranian case, of course, they were boasting about their wonderfully advanced missiles and their super advanced technology, and they threatened that their second ballistic missile attack, which they call True Promise 2, would be devastating. That not one brick would be on top of another in Tel Aviv. That did not happen, but it didn't prevent them from keep telling their people in their media that Tel Aviv was in ruins and people were wandering around and so on. They killed everybody and so on. Usual stuff. Big talk, no real action. And the Israelis, at the moment, the Israelis get some tankers from some friendly power that lends them, or if the Boeing company were to get up from his sleep and deliver the tankers that the Israelis ordered a long time ago, the nuclear installations will disappear, will be all blown up in 24 hours. That's it. So for 35 years and more, the regime has compelled the Iranian people, that is to say, a cultured people, they're really a cultured and sophisticated people, to suffer economically and to be poor and impoverished for the nuclear program. In order to make, the Ayatollah Khamenei, the great master of the world, and make him a nuclear weapon and so on. And of course, they haven't done it. The Israelis themselves acquired the nuclear weapon between 1956 and 1967, when the population was less than 2 million, and the economy was very small, and it was hard to repair an automatic transmission in Tel Aviv. It was an agricultural country, but nuclear weapons, they got in less than 10 years. The Iranians have been spending billions and billions and billions ever since 2008, and they do not have a nuclear weapon. But they're too close to having it. And so as soon as the Israelis can, they will bomb them. If the United States wishes to participate, they're welcome to do it. But if the United States participates or not, they're going to do it, and they're not going to ask permission, from the government of Portugal or the government of the United States.
And to get for just further thought on the bigger picture as well in the Middle East, and as you say, I don't think it can be denied. There's been all this talk about, Russia, Iran, BRICS, these alliances, but we've seen, Russia just drop the ball every time on their allies, like Gaddafi in Libya a decade ago. Syria just collapsed. Russia seemed to have dropped the ball there as well. And so, I lump all of these together, right? Syria, Israel, Gaza, Iran. Do you think there will be, if there's an attack on Iran, that'll be limited, or it can escalate?
No. The only intention is to attack specific nuclear installations, and to put them out of action. Nuclear installations may be protected by being underground or whatever you want, but actually, in the end, there is machinery there, and you can destroy the machinery. If you attack the 7 targets, which is the uranium extrafluoride plant in Isfahan, and the reactor in Arak, and the separation plant in Natanz, and the separation plant in Fordow, if you knock them out, they will take 20 years for Iran to get the pieces together again. It's just one of those things. These are fragile equipment. All the critical components are imported. They're very proud of what they make themselves, and they do make a lot of things, but they don't make a sufficiency of things. So it's like having an automobile with everything except for, the accelerator, the spark plugs, whatever you call it, the fuel injection, a motor without fuel injection. So the Israelis, as I think the world knows, are very familiar with the nuclear program. And they're familiar with the single different installations, and they're familiar with the rooms in which different things are done. And in fact, they do not observe the nuclear program from the outside, like from satellites or something like that. And they don't try to deduce it from intercepts. They're actually inside the program. That must be pretty clear by now. Because on December 4 last year, when they bombed, finally, the first time bombed Iran, they went to a specific base of Parchin, and they bombed the particular buildings where they had the mixing machinery to mix the rocket fuel to make the ballistic missiles. So they knew that this building, it's a base, which has quite a lot of buildings. If you see the photographs, there are a lot of sort of large buildings in 3 areas, and so they went to 1. So they're inside the program. They're not visiting Iran; they live there, and so they know where to hit.
Yeah, and you have your recent book, "The Art of Military Innovation: Lessons from the Israel Defense Forces." I've been reading a bit of it, and it's fascinating. It speaks to the strength of Israel. I want to ask you about, where do you see Israel currently with this conflict in Gaza? They've said they're keeping troops in Syria and Lebanon. How do you see this, evolving?
Well, the book is about research and development, and the research and development comes from the scientific culture of Israel, which is the product of many strands, from the old German physics and all that, to the Russian mathematics, which arrived with the Russian Jews. Israelis thought that they were teaching mathematics in a proper way. And then the Russian Jews arrived and say, "You're teaching monkey mathematics. This is not mathematics. Our physmat, our Soviet physmat is the real mathematics." So after a resistance, after trying to, say no, they accepted it. They accepted it in all the schools. And that is one of the reasons they suddenly exploded with high tech. They have physmat. Now, other European countries could also have physmat. They choose not to. So they have physmat. They have, there's different technical capabilities. They've learned to do, many different things like welding, exhausting material, that kind of stuff. And they have this overall ability. Therefore, anything to do with weapons, and counter weapons and ballistic missile defense, they have, China does not have ballistic missile defense, nor Russia, nor America, but they have it. And this is all made in Israel, that kind of stuff. So they can do all that. None of it, no part of that is relevant to deal with Gaza or even Hamas. The Gaza, you have 900,000 people who have not been allowed to behave like refugees all over the world, which is, my 2 sides fought the war, we lost the war, so we have to move on. All through history, two peoples fight, one loses, and he moves on, to a new life somewhere else. They emigrate, they go to Australia, they simply go across the street. The Arab countries, as you know, have behaved, have resolutely refused to help the Palestinians, to receive them. Otherwise, the Arab world is very big. 900,000 Palestinians could disappear in a month if they were invited to different places. Many of them are educated, and useful citizens. There are electricians, there are plumbers, there are doctors. In fact, there are more doctors per capita in Gaza than in Beverly Hills, California. Because with all this aid they got from Norway and all these countries that feel that sending money to the Palestinians is a good thing, it's not a good thing. Not a good thing. It's a terrible thing because you keep them there instead of inducing them to behave like everybody always behaved. When you lose a war, you move on. You don't stand there. And the world has been very cruel to the Palestinians. They thought they would be nice to the Palestinians. They were not. By keeping them there in a crowded place, and I'm not talking about the native population of Gaza, which is possibly 180,000. 180,000 people could live in Gaza, and many of them are still living on their own land, and so on. I'm talking about the refugees who should have been like the refugees after World War II. There were 25 million refugees in Europe. If we had UNRWA, the United Nations Relief, whatever, in Western Europe, today, when you drive around in Western Europe, you come across big camps of displaced East Germans, wandering Polands, lost Ukrainians, etc. All over Europe, the big refugee camps, one after the other. So this long-term error, which is a long-term tragedy for the Palestinians, this is there. The Israelis are not going to kill them all. They've killed very few in this fighting, as you know, out of the vast number. So none of the military technology helps with that. Having high tech doesn't help. What it does, it enables to defeat and humiliate Ayatollah Khamenei, his Pasdaran Revolutionary Guards, and their kind of engineering, so to speak, with their crude ballistic missiles that, they spent billions and billions to build these ballistic missiles, which in the end killed one Palestinian. Not even a Jew. Some poor guy from Gaza tried to find refuge in Jericho, and the whole thing landed on his head. So this type of thing the Israelis can deal with. They cannot find a magic solution for the distorted, the fact that you have 900,000 people who have been stranded in a kind of distorted reality. Brought about, imagine in all the wars in Africa, if you had UNRWA, then today you would have Hutus, refugees from Rwanda would still be sitting there in Eastern Congo, reproducing, making more children, demanding schools and hospitals and so on, and harboring revenge in their hearts to go back to Rwanda and kill more Hutus. That in fact happened for a year or so, and after that it was stopped. Médecins Sans Frontières was the only NGO who said, we are nurturing another Palestinian problem here in Goma, East Congo. And then the whole thing dissolved. So that problem is the world's problem. And all these benevolent governments like the Norwegians and the usual suspects think that they're being nice to somebody they're not. They're condemning one more generation of Palestinians to grow up with nothing except with images of their lost palaces in Palestine. As you know, every single refugee lost a house in Palestine, which has 18 rooms and is extended on a hillside and very tasteful staircases and so on. They are not the actual hovels, so, no window, one front door type of place that they come from, but they are these palaces of the mind.
I want to ask you about America, but before going back to the U.S., since we're in the Middle East still, thoughts on Erdogan In Turkey, Trump just said that Erdogan told him that he was responsible for taking down Assad. What's most important for you when it comes to Erdogan and Turkey, and what some say
he didn't take down Assad. If he says that, the man is delusional. What took down Assad is that over the years, the Alawites were the privileged people in Syria, and therefore were not less and less of them were willing to be soldiers and policemen, and they all became smugglers and customs officers and things like that. So Assad came to rely more and more on Hezbollah. And when the Israelis drove a spear through the belly of Hezbollah, he had no protection. When he had no protection, less than 1,000 of these Sunni Islamic State militants that were up there, vaguely protected by Turkey, they just drove to Damascus and so on, because Assad had lost the protection of his own people, because his own people had become bourgeois. They were not willing to be soldiers and guards and policemen. And so once Hezbollah was knocked out, Assad had no protection. Now, for Erdogan to claim that he did it, is like a tourist watching a volcano and there's an eruption. He says, "Oh, it was me because I tapped on I pressed down on the crater or something." Erdogan is full of illusions, and also he's full of threats. And he talks as if there's a balance of power between Turkey and Israel. He talks and in fact, I see social media by his followers who say that they have more airplanes than the Israelis, more fighters than Israelis, or they have more ships or something, more tanks, as if makes a difference because they're one generation behind, maybe 2 generations behind. It's not clear. So, there's no military strength. Erdogan has no real military strength except to fight Kurds without weapons, preferably civilians, or if not, Kurds with Kalashnikovs, and he has tanks and so on. So he's just boasting. But hotheads take him seriously in Turkey. So this type of thing cannot be dismissed. This can be dangerous because there are all these uneducated Turks, these Anatolian Turks, who believe this nonsense. Now, as you know, in the last election, Erdogan did not win a majority. He is the president because the other parties couldn't agree. There are many Turks, probably most Turks, more than half of Turks, now who are Europeans. They're not Anatolian peasants who believe this sort of nonsense. So they know the truth, and so on. But Erdogan, of course, has now reached the point where he has officially abandoned democracy by arresting the very popular chief of the opposition. Sooner or later, there will be an election. He will definitely lose it. But still, there is some danger involved because, he himself knows that the Turkish Air Force couldn't survive, one day against the Israeli Air Force. He knows that, but his followers don't, and he talks in a way that, it's always dangerous when you have people warmongering and so on.
I want to get back to the United States. On this podcast that I've been doing over a decade, I've been trying to gauge the strength of the American empire. Long ago, I interviewed Michael Beckley, who wrote a book, who said that America will remain the one superpower. In your book, written long ago, The Endangered American Dream, you warned of American decline. In Unheard, you recently write, quote, "Unless the U.S. industrial economy is vigorously rebuilt, the U.S. armed forces will have to import their vehicles and weapons from where? Likely China. So good luck with that." And so coming back to America, how do you gauge its strength? What's going on with these tariffs? Do you think it'll be able to reindustrialize and other issues such as the status of the dollar as world reserve and so forth?
Well, let me tell you, as you mentioned, I've written quite a few books. Most of my books were about strategy, the logic of war and peace, how to be strong, why and so on. And those books were widely read. and widely translated. And a lot of people, they teach them in their war colleges. And so whatever good ideas I have, I can say they're disseminated. They did not remain in a box. But I completely failed with the book that you mentioned, The Endangered American Dream. In my book, I said, listen, globalization is great. It will make the whole world richer. Unfortunately, it will deindustrialize the United States, which means that in this town where there were 2 factories, that town where there were 4, that town there was 1, those factories will die because the production will shift to China. And once those factories dies, many people will leave those towns, but the ones who remain behind will be degraded from working people to people who live on public assistance, on welfare, on handouts. And then with that degradation, with that loss of self-worth, will come other problems like drugs and so on. That was the Endangered American Dream. And that book was published very elegantly by Simon & Schuster, very well. It was reviewed in all the newspapers, but unfortunately, because it went against free trade, which is the secular religion of the Americans, the actual religion is free trade. Reviewers insulted the book. They didn't say, I'm right or wrong. They said things like, for example, the leading economist, the number 1 economist, in the New York Review of Books, reviews it as blame the foreigner first. It's nothing of the kind. It was simply saying that you cannot have a society which is of consumers. So your globalization is wonderful for the consumer. Mr. John Smith, consumer, he needs a screwdriver, 1 screwdriver. So he goes to Walmart, which is the biggest shop and something, and he doesn't buy a screwdriver. For the amount of money mentally he was going to buy a screwdriver, he's offered a set of 99 screwdrivers, from the smallest to the biggest, and made in China at the price which is completely impossible. Now, that is how it begins, and then the factories close, and then people get degraded from being workers who can pay for the house and themselves and send a son to college and all that just by going down the street to the factory. And what you have is welfare dependence and all that kind of stuff. And this simple mechanical sequence of events was masked by a whole lot of music about how great it is to leave behind monotonous factory work in order to go into services, like architectural design, foreign exchange trading in Manila, and all kinds of great things, like being consultants, marriage advisor, urban development, and services will pay much more. They're not dirty, they're not boring, they're not repetitive. Except when you wrote this book, Endangered American Dream, I used the statistics of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I was able to demonstrate that a factory worker who used to earn $40 an hour, not now, then $40 an hour, then the job, he either gets no job when the factory closes, or he gets a job as a security guard at Walmart for $15 an hour, even less at that time, $10 an hour. And this is the formerly proud industrial worker, went to church and everything else. Now he's a security guard who stands around watching when people go to the shop to buy the products and the objects that people like him used to make. And this was completely obscured by the music, by the fervent singing of the hymns of free trade, free trade, free trade, and by, the music about boring factory work. Who wants to keep that? We can all be in services, we can all be consultants and so on. And so I can say that honestly that I wrote both The Endangered American Dream, both Turbo Capitalism. I worked very hard at them. They were published very well by Simon and Schuster, very elegantly, very well presented. They were translated in quite a few languages and completely failed to deliver a simple message. Now, however, with the Trump administration, these arguments are no longer relevant because what they've discovered is that if you do not rebuild U.S. shipbuilding industry, which means shipyards, but also means machine shops where they cut the metal and so on, if you don't do that, you can't have a U.S. Navy. The attempt to build just U.S. Navy ships by hand, is become a losing proposition. They cost billions and billions and billions, and they're not really, it's not right. It just doesn't work. If you want to have a Navy, you have to have shipbuilding. And if you want to build ships, you have to have a civilian shipbuilding industry. Otherwise, you don't have a base. And you have to do everything as a prototype. One prototype, two prototypes, it doesn't work. And so that's one thing that we need to rebuild. And by the way, Trump has, as you know, promised to do something about it, and he has, because the China tariffs by themselves, with some additional, just by themselves, are, as we speak, they're saving many companies that were, which had been shrunk down and were very small but still alive. Now they'll be able to revive. Factories making shoes, boots, pencil holders, I don't know, umbrella stands, whatever, 10,000 industrial products, and also machine tools, machine shops. And then you can start rebuilding it, rebuilding the industrial base of the United States. And this can be done just with tariffs. Now, more can be done in those cases where there is entrepreneurship and designship and concepts exemplified by the cars made by Tesla, which are cars and everything, but they're not made like Detroit made cars. There's it's reviving industries, but not with the same methods. But there's a need to rebuild the industrial economy across. And of course, finally, that involves a redirection of U.S. education, because it was part of the great choral singing about services that American high schools stopped teaching people the trades, to work wood, metal, this and that, because they're all going to be foreign exchange dealers in Hong Kong anyway, that kind of stuff. So education has to be restarted and redirected. The American educational system, since the age of globalization, has been pushing students to study, soft social sciences, all kinds of stuff, from gender identity to climate change education, whatever it is. You have to go back and teach basics, to teach the kind of things that enables people to get a job, not just to be woodworkers and mechanics, but also to be mathematicians, for example. How many sociologists does the United States needs to produce every year? 1 million? I think not, maybe 7. So universities have to be redirected. And that is actually feasible to do, because so much, even the richest universities, famously Harvard and so on, even the richest universities are being getting grants of billions of dollars to teach the wrong subjects, like, area studies and, all kinds of, stuff that. So there has to be a redirection of education to the basics, the proper subjects, Greek, Latin, mathematics, algebra, calculus, all those things, and civil engineering. And in high schools, they should teach people how to use their tools, like they used to make wood objects, to make metal objects, repair cars,
So I used to say that if I were young again today, I would go into the trade. So would you say then you're optimistic on America going forward? It's not going to collapse tomorrow.
Right. It's not going to collapse tomorrow, and therefore, if you go through the steps, you can see that the American system can accept a lot of failures. Reindustrializations can fail in Oregon, but can succeed in Washington. Uh, Shifting education from stupid subjects to real subjects will not succeed here, but it will succeed there. And there's going to be a heterogeneous advance and so on. But then there's also some things that concern me as an amateur scholar, somebody who has studied the classics, Greek, Latin, and basic history and so on. And that is that part of this transformation of not teaching mathematics and engineering, but teaching these social sciences. Along the way, there was a collapse in basic scholarly standards. And as you know, the Columbia University has been much in the news because its Department of Middle Eastern Affairs, these are all people who went immediately after October 7 and said, great, they killed people, they raped them, they burned babies, great, great, wonderful. And so they were attacked politically. But actually, if you ignore the politics and you look at the books published by all the members of the very large Department of Middle Eastern Studies, that of course became bigger because various Arab princes gave money. If you look at the studies they do, there is no basic research. There is no discovery and publication of important Arabic texts. So there are many important Arabic texts which have not been edited, which remain in archives and libraries, unedited, unprinted, untranslated, unexplained. They have not done any basic scholarly work. They haven't written respectable histories. They haven't done scholarship. In other words, people who shout against all the education are missing the point, which is even if they have not done that, is their abysmal literary output of that department. A large, expensive Department of Middle Eastern Studies that has produced no books that belong to the academic library. In fact, the guy there, whatever his name is, Mazda or whatever, who made himself famous by saying, my heart is full of joy, I'm so enthusiastic. His dissertation, his book is about ideas of sexuality in the Arab world. And it's basically an essay listing this Lebanese homosexual and that Syrian, lesbian. That's it. It's nothing analytical about it. There's no basis, no documentation, and so on. So that is another little twist in the story. But America will survive. The reason America survives is because it is not monolithic, but heterogeneous. And it's not rigid, but flexible. And above all, that Americans are, the general American culture is optimistic. In fact, the worst word there is in the Arab world is new. There's in fact a whole religious condemnation against newness, changes in Islam and so on. And the best word in America is new. You go up to people and say, oh, I have a new pasta. And immediately they all rush to try it. They're not, people like me, I was brought up in Palermo, Sicily. You come to me and shout new pasta, I say, just go away, buzz off. I don't want to try whatever this is with jam maybe and things like that. But Americans are optimistic, and optimism is good for business. Optimism is good to adapt and change.
And I guess for your concluding thoughts, I've tried to cover as much as I could. War, empire, the economy. Is there anything else, that keeps you up at night that you're really concerned with?
Well, what I'm concerned by is the degradation of public discourse in the world, including America, due to the fact that the social media have hit us, and there has not been enough time for the normal human reaction to such a devastating blow to the ordinary way of doing things. And then, of course, there will be a reaction. People are recovering even now. My grandchildren are in California, and in California, all the grandchildren and all the children of the Silicon Valley moguls, none of them have a smartphone. Not one of them. They're not allowed to use a smartphone. They are not allowed to use a screen to read instead of having a book in their hands. So there is a cultural reaction at the basic level, starting with the elite, of course, including the high-tech elite. They are maybe the first to say to their children, forget it, no smartphone, and that. So there is a reaction underway. It is started at the elite level, but in the meantime, we still, that reaction hasn't happened. So, Mr. Croat, I'm happy to talk to you, and I'll be happy to talk to you again.
Okay. All right.
Bye.
All right. Okay.
Bye.
See you. Thanks.
Hvala lepo.